Hello, patrons. Welcome to tomorrow's STEAM Discovery 2.04. My name's Jade. I have next to me an awesome Carrie Ann, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Natalie Rens of Astreia, a company dedicated to sustainability not only on Earth but also in space. So diving right into it, because I already know I have just about a million questions.
At least.
At least. Can you go ahead and just kind of give us a little breakdown on who you are and basically what you do?
Fair. My background was very much in science, and so I've come on a bit of a weird flip into the whole technology space. But I started off with biomedical science and this kind of very childish or young idea that I would be able to go off and explore the Amazon and search for new medicine and use this to create something that would help people, I guess, make cures for people. And as I went on, I got more and more interested in neuroscience and then more interested in cognitive neuroscience. And I eventually did my PhD in neuroscience, looking at how do you use machine learning and computational models to predict human decisions. And from that, it showed me, I think, for the first time, the power of coding and technology.
Yeah.
And the more and more I looked into it, the more I thought that you could actually start to understand a lot more about humans and create a lot more solutions for humans by looking at artificial intelligence. That was really what got me excited about it. And then I had an opportunity to come to Silicon Valley when I was about a year out from finishing, and that just flipped my whole mindset because you saw this insane rush in society for AI and all of these different applications that you could do with it. And I just felt like I'd been in a bubble in academia.
Sure.
And yeah, so from that I went straight into a role on AI strategy with Office of the Queensland Chief Entrepreneur, which was with the government in Australia.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was a really amazing opportunity, and at the same time I was running an AI meetup and just trying to get more and more people engaged with AI and excited about all the things that we could be doing with it. And I think at the same time I was still looking for that kind of Amazon experience or something where you could really discover something and explore and do something that would help humankind. And I'd been following Elon Musk and SpaceX, obviously, I think as most of us do. Yeah, and then it was really the Falcon Heavy launch last year in February, where something in my brain started to just like click into place, and that made me realize for the first time that all of this background that I had with humans could potentially actually be applied to this next goal that we're gunning for, in terms of being able to get to Mars. And before that, I hadn't really thought that I could work on this kind of thing because it seemed like it was for engineers, and I was very much science and humans, and I just hadn't pieced together that opportunity was there. And so from there, I panicked and I started working and started Astraea pretty soon after that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I'm like, first of all, I'm super happy that you made that switch in your brain, because we absolutely need that element, especially if we want to, someday go to Mars and maybe even beyond.
Yeah.
But so it sounds like at the core of it, you really have this passion for helping people. Because, you mentioned like going to the Amazon and discovering, like maybe a new medication or something that'll help humanity. So in what ways do you envision AI being able to help humanity?
I think AI can help in a lot of ways, but I think the real power it always gives us is that you can analyze patterns in data much better with AI than you can with humans. And I started to have these really trippy recurring dreams after the Starman launch, when I was really reading all of these articles on what is actually being done in terms of automating activities on the International Space Station, and what are really like the latest advancements coming from NASA, et cetera, about supporting human life and making sure that everything is always optimal, right? That you're never going to have a failure in your carbon dioxide machine or things like this. And, I started to have these crazy dreams where I just wake up in a panic and with this sense that something had gone wrong in the spaceship, or something had gone wrong in the habitat. And it wasn't like one single thing had happened, that something had broken, but it was like the entire balance or the equilibrium of this entire environment had failed. And I would wake up and try to save people. It happened again and again and again. And it just kind of started to make me think about this idea that if you had AI that was able to monitor all the conditions in an environment, whether it's a ship or a habitat on Mars or anywhere on Earth, where you're also trying to sustain life. And if you took in all of this data about the air quality or the temperature, the external conditions, the resources that you need, with AI, you have the ability to actually start to calculate from all of that masses of data, what is it that's actually nominal or optimal for human life, and what is it that's starting to look like it's going wrong before it even gets to a point that it is wrong.
That's interesting.
So that was where I started to get really excited about it, and actually started looking at a lot of different places like refugee camps in Antarctica.
Oh, wow.
And any space where you're really trying to optimize for human life, and at the moment it's hard to do, even in houses, but yeah.
For sure. That's funny. Yeah, I can't even figure out what the optimal temperature for my house is for me anyway.
Exactly, let alone an extreme environment like Antarctica or Mars.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's definitely fascinating and very important as well, because I mean, I think that your dreams were kind of trying to tell you something, that when it comes to supporting a group of humans, like there's so many little intricacies that if something goes wrong, goodness knows the whole system's thrown off, and before you know it, you know, what seemed like a small error ends up becoming almost fatal. Or at least that's how it is in the sci-fi books that I read.
Yeah,
But
even on the Nat Geo series, right, where a human goes insane,
Yeah.
that kills everyone.
Yes.
Or even like the Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton, I think also kind of explores it a little. Once one little thing is off, it's like it's a
balance.
chain reaction.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Very cool. So using then AI to help humanity and then ultimately help us further our presence in space, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about Astraea. So upon founding Astraea, what was like your big vision for this? Like, what was your main goal for it?
I really think it was founded in a panic.
Oh my goodness,
It was,
I love that, so urgent.
It was, I think it was like 7th of February for us, like when Starman was launched, and I just started reading crazy amounts of books on the latest in like psychology in space and anything I could find about human factors, and looking at what private companies were doing in terms of human survival, because obviously we have SpaceX and others that are gunning for the rockets to get us there, and NASA is obviously contributing a lot of work, but they work at a different pace, right?
Yeah.
And if we, for example, succeed in getting to Mars in 10 years' time, I don't think that at the current level of technology that investment in the technology for survival, that there would really be what I would deem adequate knowledge of and support for surviving there. And so it was really, I think it was like 4 months to the day, and I just started it with just simply the idea that we had to enable sustainable life.
Yeah.
And it took me a lot of time from there to think about how do you actually do this. I first looked at wearables. How do you start to track all the physiological signals? Because obviously, again, you can use AI to, for example, detect when you have an anomaly that could be leading to a heart failure.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think I got to a point where I thought that if you wanted to really make sure that the entire group of people was not only supported in terms of survival needs, but also supported psychologically, that you needed to be tracking or supporting at a bigger level. And that really led me ultimately to think that if you control the habitat and you make sure that entire habitat has some kind of like guardian system in some way acting, then you can ensure survival for everyone.
Interesting.
That's how we got there.
Did you get a chance to look into European Space Agency, ESA, a number of years back? Because we've been doing, well, we haven't been doing STEAM, but I have been doing Tomorrow Space for 12 years now. So it's sort of vague and in the back there, but Mars 500, where they had some astronauts and they sort of locked them into a thing and you know, had that. And they had to do a couple of them because there was one crew that kind of went a little psycho, or like one person on there that kind of went a little...
Is that the one where the guy tried to get into the girl and then so it's like fractured the whole group as well? Was it?
Something like that, yeah. It was an interesting, but it was interesting. But you're right, like there aren't a whole lot of those sorts of things going on right now, whether it's Mars simulations with, you know, at Hawaii or, you know, high seas or, you know, anything along those lines. There aren't a lot of them and they're not very prevalent. So I could see where you trying to look into something that, like, there's just not a lot of information out there all the way around, and that's absolutely a huge concern. Again, above and beyond the International Space Station, I suppose. which doesn't really delve into a whole lot of the psychology with all of that.
I think a lot of the focus that I see is on basically how do you form an optimal team that is going to get on with each other. And in some ways, obviously, I think this is important, but in other ways, I think if we really are serious about establishing an entire, more permanent colony somewhere else, like Mars, then you can't actually solve for it by simply trying to validate that every single human that goes up there is going to get along with the others, because very soon it's going to be more than 5 people.
Yeah,
right? For sure.
And there's going to be so many factors once they get there as well.
And I think the other part of it is, I think in some ways it discredits the fact that the environment itself can be made more functional for human psychology. And if you think about how the space station currently runs, I was reading Scott Kelly's book, and it kind of discusses how there's crazy noises everywhere and it smells really bad. And, you know, like it's not actually in any way tuned for how we should operate or how we can feel some sense of normality there.
Sure.
And not to mention that if you start to have that kind of detrimental environment, you're cognitively not functioning well either.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also just kind of like the innate shock of being off the planet. Like, I don't think that's something that, as you said, we can control for, because simply we don't know what it's like. I mean, of course, in the Apollo missions, there were people on the moon, but not for weeks or months at a time, the way we're ultimately envisioning it. And goodness knows what it must feel like to be on literally, like, it's already weird being in a different state or a different country,
Right.
but being on a different planet, like, you know, so it's fascinating that you're delving into that. So you mentioned that, you know, there's a lot of factors we need to take in consideration to make an environment as, I guess, hospitable as possible. So in which ways do you envision, like, the AI being able to help with that?
I think I've been approaching it at a kind of a pyramid level of what do you need as a human. And so right now we're very much focused on the fundamental layer. If you can't ensure that your oxygen supply and your water supply and your energy is very efficient, and that you have a very good prediction of what that horizon is, then you're really sitting with this kind of fundamental fear about, you know, whether something is suddenly going to kill you, or like you have a crack in the environment and you have no way of actually having predicted that something was already weak in that spot. And so that's kind of my first thinking, is you need to be able to really govern the resources that are keeping you alive.
Maslow's hierarchy
Yeah,
almost.
yeah.
Cool.
And then I think once you can make sure that these basic needs are met, then you kind of move more into the psychological aspect. And it's definitely, I think, harder there in terms of coming up with a solution. I think we can do a lot in terms of detecting what kind of state people are in. So even work that's being done here, for example, if you start to move your thumb slower when you're using your phone, they've correlated this or predicted that people are becoming depressive. And there are weird metrics even in terms of the way that you start to move in a room. Your gait can actually indicate that you're becoming ill. And I think the craziest one actually I've read is there's like very young research using Wi-Fi where they can use just the deterrence of the Wi-Fi signals.
Exactly.
And like read your heart rate and your sleep patterns. And if you can detect changes in your sleep patterns, that's also a really good indicator that something is going wrong psychologically. So we can detect these things, but then in terms of like, how do you solve for this? I think you still need to have some level of human intervention, hopefully, or maybe a robot, maybe VR if we get there. But,
yeah, so in that way then the AI is more so like helping us to identify and detect, and then it's kind of up to us to then like go and fix it basically, or monitor it, or...
I think at this point, I think there are also people who are developing AI-based therapists and or like virtual avatars. And this is really important because a lot of people that have mental illness or are feeling, I guess not feeling like they're normal in society, don't tend to want to go to see a normal therapist. Or if you've got PTSD, then it's like already a stigma that, you know, you're weak if you go and do this. And so I think that's actually been a really fascinating development in starting to create an avatar that can read your emotional responses and step you through these kind of processes without having a human have to do it. So
that's fascinating. Cool. As somebody who goes to therapy, I completely understand that.
Yeah,
a million %. There's a really interesting question from our chat room. Astro YYZ says there's a lot of existential fear surrounding AI. Elon Musk has even spoken about concerns about this. How do you counter those concerns? We talked a little bit earlier, right? Yeah, exactly. We talked a little bit before the show. We asked, do you watch Black Mirror? And your response was like, absolutely not. That is. I can totally see how that could be a concern. Do you have a strategy around that, maybe at all?
Like a PR strategy for AI?
Black Mirror's just written, it's fine.
Yeah, I think what we were talking about before in terms of it's important to understand that the technology itself is not bad in any way. It is more powerful than a lot of technology that we've had so far. And so I kind of sit on the fence in terms of, I understand why Elon Musk has put out these warnings, and I think in some ways that's important to do. And it's important to start to think now, what are the repercussions if we don't do this well and we don't govern how we develop AI?
Sure.
At the same time, I think in terms of general society, and we were talking before, I was in a public role really trying to advocate for AI and its use in entrepreneurial endeavors. And a lot of the fear that I came into was really not conducive to the problems that needed to be solved in a way. So if people are focused on panicking about Terminator, they're not really focused on addressing the more present issues that we need to be thinking about. How do we retrain jobs?
Exactly.
And how do we start to introduce measures that are removing bias, which is like really.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I was just reading an article recently about how AI is obviously like going to be one of the next big revolutions in tech, but it's only as good as the data that we feed into it.
Sure.
And I mean, biases are almost extremely difficult to get down to like a zero bias. But how do you envision, ensuring that the AI that we ultimately rely on is as, I guess, reliable as possible when it comes to making sure, because I'm not entirely well acquainted with how AI works or like what happens to the data once it gets put in. But I did understand that if the data is only coming from a very specific source and it's not entirely representative of the population at large, there could be some like discrepancies there. So how do you envision like kind of overcoming that or avoiding that?
I think there are a number of strategies people use. The first is to try to simply not label the data in a way that you can introduce bias.
Got it.
So if you're trying to look at professional outcomes and you put female and male like in there, or even in some ways if you put historical data and you put CEO in there, obviously because we've had far more male CEOs in the past, if you then ask it for a prediction about the future, it's going to statistically take that information. It's going to give a female a lower percentage chance of actually being a CEO. And so in some ways you have to think about the labels that you're actually, if you're doing supervised learning, the labels that you're putting into it, and then be smarter about what those labels actually mean historically. In other ways, I think some of the issues, for example, with I think the Compass data with where they're trying to look at reoffense rates in the US. I think with things like that, when you're looking at, for example, prisoner data, there are also even things such as, like, if you put in that somebody lives in Compton, that's already biasing your data, and without you actually really starting to think, if you're just putting in location data, you can still start to draw out those patterns simply from what we know is a correlation. So I don't think there's like a straightforward way to solve for that, but being really cognizant about the data that you're putting in the first place. And then I think the other side is that once you've developed these algorithms, that you test them. There are, like in some of the cases that have come out, if a third party came in and just tried to validate it against actual data, they found that there was this insane bias. So that should have been checked in the first place. Again, with like all of these like crazy things about like labeling black people as gorillas and then like just trying to take like the word gorilla out as a label, it's not really fixing the fact that you didn't go through that thoroughly. But it's not, you can't fix and you can't catch everything, but I think you just have to be in a mindset that is an important thing to be thinking about.
So AI really is kind of like, it's a check on humanity. It's in, so it's kind of like telling society to get its S together in so many words. Wow, very interesting. Never thought of it like that. Okay, so we were going through images earlier before the show, and I saw a couple of Mars images or illustrations.
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about what your vision for Mars is, or what that project's all about?
In terms of what we're working on?
Yeah,
In terms
exactly.
So I guess we have about 10 years theoretically until the first rockets are headed there, and we need to have habitats in place that are going to be able to, as best as they can, make sure that the very contentious chances that we really have of surviving there are at least the highest possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And so my primary focus right now is on how do we actually develop this AI system, or how do we develop the software that with sensors is able to monitor these environments and to try to predict anything that's going wrong as soon as we can, to try to send this to mission control as rapidly as possible, given that we have this 2 to 24 minute or 4 to 24 minute communication delay, and then just really start to operate an environment even before humans are in there, to make sure that we can actually accurately govern, especially in the different physics that are there on Mars. And then from there, either through partnership or if we get there ourselves, I think the other major issue that we're facing right now is how do you actually build all these habitats there? Sure. And I don't really know if we have a really good solution yet, given that we have such huge weight constraints on shipping anything there.
Oh, sure.
And a lot of people have been like, yeah, but we can just build them with robots. But if anybody, I'm not going to work on robots because they're insane.
Right.
Even I was at Amazon Mars, and they had Boston Dynamics, which is obviously the most amazing robots that we have on Earth. And even on their demo, they've the dog flipped out on stage and KO'd itself. And it's but robots are freaking hard. They're hard enough on Earth, let alone just shipping autonomous robots to Mars and being it's going to build the house for us.
Yeah, relying on that. My goodness.
So
That's funny.
I think that's something that we haven't yet figured out a really good strategy for, and so it's definitely in our thinking is how do we start to play with modular designs or maybe even origami-based designs.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, you can actually use AI for really cool generative design where they've used this in structures there we go.
There it is.
Design.
That's really cool.
This is done by Dave Lloyd, who's just a wizard. He's amazing. But yeah, I'll take a seg.
Yeah, definitely.
But
oh, wow.
But yeah, I think a lot of the concept ideas that are important have been, first, how do you have something which is modular? So how do you draw from how nature is actually used,
Exactly.
Fractal designs, etc., to do something which can, you can fill out the one kind of module at a time and then keep filling as more humans come, and then you can start to actually have this very biological growth. And I think
very organic.
Yeah, Oceanics, the floating city designs with Big they've also gone for kind of a hexagon. I think I'm slightly in love with hexagons.
Yeah.
It's this very...
It's great. It looks amazing.
So flattering to look at. Just satisfying.
Very efficient,
Yeah.
very efficient, natural way of designing. So yeah, that's something, and then obviously you have to think about all the different aspects, such as radiation. So you have the regolith. We probably don't have this thick enough on here, but I'm also kind of banking on the fact that we have some kind of material advances in our plastics, or even maybe glass, but probably plastics. So that you can actually design polyethylene, for example, that can absorb some of the radiation.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And then if you put, obviously, plants, that's good for us psychologically.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe the plants that are at the top of this are going to have some crazy mutations, but...
They're avocado plants, I can tell from here.
Really?
No, I'm joking.
I was like,
totally
they
joking.
might be. But yeah, hopefully some of those plants are actually able to provide food for us eventually.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And then this is solar or no?
Yeah, I think we're pretty. I think most people would agree we're going to be nuclear based for the most part. I think because obviously if there's a massive dust storm, then we're screwed with the solar.
Exactly.
Right.
But yeah, I guess that's in a way technical to solve, and in a way political to solve.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, for now, I think we'd also have solar.
Yeah. So it sounds like the AI approach, or AI sounds very holistic then when it comes to planning for ultimate like human exploration of different planets, because it's, I mean, yeah, like you said, you kind of started with a pyramid where it's like, okay, let's make sure their basic needs are met. Okay, let's go to their psychological, and then, you know, so on and so forth. So that's really fascinating that AI is able to kind of help us build these solutions from all these aspects, and even ones that we either didn't think of or we didn't pay too much attention to. Because like you said, you know, there's the engineers out there, and there's, you know, the people who are kind of getting ahead of themselves in a way. It's like, okay, we have the rocketry, we have the mechanics, but let's dial it back a little and actually think about, okay, well, there's a lot of human factors that
what happens when we get there?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm really glad you're doing this work.
When it sounds
so
like
that it's not too late.
yeah, no joke. But it also
Yeah.
sounds like AI, in a weird way, I'm going to sound like the lazy American here, is taking a lot off of your plate, right? Like,
Yeah.
back in the day, I used to have to memorize my mother's phone number, my friend's phone number, like whatever kind of thing. And now I have a phone that just sort of does that for me. I don't have to think about it anymore. So there's some basics.
Start of a cyborg.
Exactly, that are sort of taking some of those things away that I don't have to sort of fill my mind with anymore. I don't have to be concerned about it necessarily because something else is taking care of it for me. Yeah, I particularly love the therapy thing. That's amazing. But I mean, that could also act as like a friend, or in theory, you expand on that, and that could be, you know, an avatar of a friend that you know, so you feel more comfortable talking to them, right?
Actually, it's kind of fascinating. If you look at any of the isolation studies, whether it's in space or whether it's remote scientific spots on Earth, they find this kind of syndrome where people will band together very strongly within the group because you're counting on each other for survival.
Yeah.
Most of the time, obviously, like if you have, like, for example, biosphere, that didn't go amazingly well.
Sure.
But most of the time, they actually band together for the most part. And if they have an external party, whether it's mission control, whether it's the people that are operating the base back home on Antarctica, for example, they find a lot of aggression actually ends up being directed back at them. So they'll rebel against the outside influence that's coming into the group.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So
Right, well, because they're not going through the same experience. You don't know what I'm going through, but you know what I'm going through.
yeah, you're like, oh, just go
Therefore-
do the thing, but like they're not actually in the stress environment. I think part of
Yeah.
it is maybe that, but then part of it is just like they need to be able to direct this emotion or energy somewhere, and it's
Yeah.
more detrimental to direct it at their own crewmates than it is to direct it at the guy who's on the line. But
Yeah.
maybe if you actually had this kind of like avatar system, everyone could just go yell at that instead.
Yeah,
Wow,
Avatar
okay.
wouldn't
Yeah.
care either way. Yeah.
But then the AI starts to develop a grudge against all of us, and it's
no,
like,
no, no, no. Technology is fine.
technology's objective. It's fine.
It's,
It's
the,
great.
what the humans do.
Make it
It's
to
us.
it. What the humans do
Always
with it.
us. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It is.
James Johnson from our YouTube channel saying there are so many Mars simulations that seem to lack the technical accuracy of the environment. You know, kind of going back to the simulations we were talking about, like high rise and everything, or high seas. Sorry, high rise, high seas, the same thing. Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I wonder, do you foresee a time where you would sort of test out this technology on maybe a Mars simulation sort of situation to kind of see, like, how are you doing this testing, I guess, is more my question.
Mars, like an analog
Yes, that's what I mean.
environment. I 100% think that we will do this, but I'm also taking a slightly different approach in terms of, I think if you actually approach a habitat as like from first principles, what you have is you have an environment where you need to have some kind of protection from the outside environment,
Yeah.
and you need to be able to make sure that all of the needs for a human are met within that bubble, right?
Yes.
And so theoretically, it's not that much different to any space that we live in on Earth if you approach it from that manner. And if you especially focus on extreme environments, whether it's underwater, like a submarine, or whether it's in the middle of the desert, where your natural resources and the environment outside are detrimental to life, and you have to be able to develop a system that can sustain life within that like very small ecosystem, that you can actually start to develop these systems in any space like that on Earth to some degree.
Sure.
And so that's the approach that we're taking in like commercially, is actually to develop on these kind of environments. And so it's not just a Mars analog, but it's yeah, it can be like a luxury resort, like in Abu Dhabi, which I was like looking at it. I was like, they had to go from zero, you know, they have like just desert, and they had to be able to create not only like very functional life with all of your water and energy supplies, etc., but very luxurious life there. And so if you can develop some of these elements in all of these spots that we have on Earth, then you have most of what I think you need. And then you can also test out in these Mars scenarios where you then start to introduce more of these psychological effects that we're interested in. And then the other aspect, which is obviously going to be insanely different once we go to Mars, is the physics. And for some, for some of that, you have to rely on the models that we have available. And then the other part is if you can kind of pre-train your models to function in environments here, and you can get them up and running on Mars before humans, then they have time to basically like start to learn or add to their training on how that environment is actually functioning.
That's interesting. Yeah, get a baseline for the environment itself.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So I'm very curious. So now that we've spoken at length all the different things we're going to have to look out for when we send humans to Mars and beyond, now I have to ask personally, would you, knowing everything that you know and all of the potential risks and all the factors, would you go?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love how you answered before I even asked. You would?
Yeah, like I don't want to be the first one. I think Elon Musk is pretty smart on his thinking.
Right? Yes.
But I think that would be phenomenal to be one of the first humans like in our entire history to be on this new land. It would be amazing. And then obviously if you're on site, you have so much more capacity to actually contribute to how you're building there and how things are operating.
Definitely.
Very
hands-on approach.
Awesome.
Yeah. Very cool.
Somebody from our chat room, FRBE0101, says, how smart does AI need to be to not have a human in the loop?
I don't know if it's a question about how smart it has to be or whether you want to not have a human in the loop at all.
How autonomous
and where it operates.
Yeah.
I think most of the time, I think it's important to understand AI as a tool. It's not, it's not a being of its own. And so I think in some ways a lot of things today function without humans in the loop because it's not important, like a recommender system on Amazon, for example.
Right.
In some ways, what we're doing with self-driving cars is going to be one of the riskiest things that we've done so far because that's something where if something goes wrong, it kills you, right?
Right.
But you're trusting it with its life to function without basically any intervention at some point.
Yeah.
So I think we can get to not having humans in the loop relatively easily, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. It's just how do you actually have the checkpoints in place that are going to make sure, like for example, if we have these environments and we succeeded creating something which has managed to learn how to optimize the system very well, you probably have a period of time where even though it knows that you want to, for example, switch off your water at this time or to open the windows or something, that it tells you to do this first. So you're still having this kind of like training period where you're still in control. And I think even as you go forward at all points in time, you need to have the capacity to override.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And that's so interesting too because, I mean, as AI has developed, the boundaries have been getting pushed further and further back in terms of if you were to tell somebody, even just 10 or 15 years ago, like, hey, there's going to be a software driving your car for you, they'd be like, heck no. And then they would be even more freaked out if you said that AI is going to be your therapist. But, as we get more acclimated to the idea that this technology can help us and that it is a tool, I think that, it's going to be less and less taboo that AI starts to take on, like you said, like a recommender system on Amazon. Like that just used to be a salesperson at Sears 20 years ago.
Right.
And nowadays it's like it's an algorithm that's like, yeah, I do want to buy those shoes, or that does look like a great toaster. So it's going to be interesting to see like what humans are going to be more and more comfortable with as AI does start to truly develop into this very useful tool. But do you ever, and this is more of like, I guess, a sci-fi question, but do you ever envision AI escalating to a point that perhaps there would be no return and that like even with human intervention, it would just turn into its own, not being, but more powerful than we can, I guess, control?
Well, to not throw you down that rabbit hole exactly.
Sorry.
Johnny Spacer in our chat room has a relatively similar
let's leave it to
question,
Johnny Spacer then.
if you don't mind.
No, please do.
What we think of AI in the future most likely will not necessarily come to pass, right? Look at nanotechnology when it was first introduced in the early 90s and nanotechnology today. Right, because I think like nanotech, you know, in the 90s was like, oh, everyone's gonna get an implant, and then it's gonna rule your whole body, and it's gonna know same sort of thing. Like it's gonna know you're sick before you know you're sick, and it's going to kill cancer, and it's not a big deal, and like, right? Like there was a whole lot of those sorts of things. I think back in the day, right?
Exactly.
And I think in a similar vein, which is what I think is the core of what you're asking.
It is, because I think the thing is that with AI, it's at least with nanotechnology, you're still talking about something tangible.
Sure.
But with AI, it's intangible. It's coding, it's algorithms, it's formulas, and you know all these things that you can't see or touch. And I think that kind of contributes to the overall weariness that people have. You know,
I mean that makes sense. There's still humans writing the code, though. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think effectively, what we're all trying to say is, where do you think the future of AI
That's
is?
what I was trying to ask. Yeah.
I think if you look at many technologies that come out, even VR, for example, and AI was first proposed in the 1950s, right? So we've gone through all these summers and winters, and I think it's always, you always have to be cautious when you claim that something is dead because it hasn't reached the timeline that people expected it to get there in. And I'm always astounded reading science fiction from way back, you know, like Arthur C. Clarke, for example.
Yes.
Like what he saw for the future was phenomenal. And maybe it didn't happen in the timeline that we thought it would happen, but it's still going to happen at some point once that exists. AI, I think there's a lot of discussion about whether we have reached the kind of summer that will continue rather than crashing and burning. And I would probably say that I support that this is really here to stay at this point, because if you look at the economics of what is going on, there is so much investment and there is such an insane rate of advancement right now that if you have those factors, if you have companies pouring money into this and you have these continuing applications that are helpful to society most of the time, then you will continue to have the human labor and the money that is necessary for that to continue to develop as a technology. And maybe it's not going to result in a superhuman in 10 years' time. But I still think if we have this drive that it will continue to develop. In terms of where we actually go in future, I think it does concern me. From Life 3.0, there's a really good, by Max Tegmark, there's a really good kind of take on why we have to be so cautious about this. I think one of the most stupid things I've seen that genuinely terrified me is people trying to train general AI on blockchain, which is if we're trying to get to a point where we have general artificial intelligence, that's something where if you get to that point, once it kind of reaches that capacity to teach itself and to learn, it can be exponential in how rapidly it advances from there. You want to have the capacity to actually shut down something if you haven't thought about what is happening. And if you train it on a blockchain system where there is no centralized system for doing this, and everyone else's basically algorithms are feeding together to create this, then the only way that you would ever manage to, if in the worst case scenario, to try to override this would be to shut down the internet or so
the nuclear option.
I do think that we have to really think really solidly about how we develop AI, because there is a chance that it gets to this point, and especially if we continue to invest in it the way that we do, then it will get to that point. I think there's no fundamental reason why we cannot develop intelligence better than us.
Interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Insane. So then, again, speaking about the future and whatnot, and all these amazing places, and yet still, with caution, all the amazing places that AI can take us, how do you envision the future of Astraea then, kind of tying into all of this?
We're definitely gunning to try to hit the targets that SpaceX have set, just because I think that they're going to be the first to go to Mars. I want us to be involved. And if we can do that faster and better than anybody else, or with partnerships with people who are also working on it, then that's my real primary goal right now. But at the same time, I think you have to accept that space is the riskiest thing you can possibly build for.
Yeah.
And if you decide to commit a commercial company to succeeding only if you build for space, then that's like not only stupid, but it's also, I think that you can be using this for so much more, like even on Earth. And it actually panics me almost equally about all of the climate change that we're facing now and all the really stupid decisions that you're seeing people make. And so I think there's a lot of talk about how do we start to use technology to help. For example, we're facing 40% urbanization in Africa and Asia. If we look at our buildings that are currently operating, they emit 39% of our carbon. And so if you can just make a difference to the way that we build buildings and build communities, and you can kind of tie in these principles that we're trying to work towards to have a sustainable habitat on another planet, that you can also end up trying to mitigate a lot of the damage that's currently being done here. So yeah, plan A is get to Mars, and then plan B at the same time is how do we start to develop systems that could help to create super sustainable cities all over Earth.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love it.
I like the way that sounds.
Yeah, right?
Sounds like a good plan. I'm in.
Good. If anybody is interested in more and wants to get involved or anything along those lines, how does somebody find Astraea?
Astraea.com.
Yeah, perfect.
Or just, find me on Twitter. It's Natalie Rens, or Astreia_AI. It's probably where I chat to most people.
Yeah? Awesome. Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you for enlightening us and having a really awesome conversation.
Yeah, thank you for indulging all my curiosity and some of my weirder questions.
Yeah,
they're amazing.
I'm sure there's more.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, a huge thank you, of course, to our patrons and everyone who contributes to tomorrow. We have actually a really cool new thing. YouTube just started this really cool thing. So you can either hit up patreon.com/TMRO, or you can go to youtube.com/TMRO/join, I believe it is. The typeface is a little tiny for me, but hopefully you can read it from there. In any case, and then you can get your name on one of these slates as well. And so you can decide how much you want to contribute, which is really cool. And have it be known that we could not do these sorts of things without you in any way, shape, or form. It would just be Ben and I, again, probably in our living room or something along those lines. And this is way better.
Which is just as entertaining.
It's, I don't know. It's hard to invite doctors over for just our living room, to be honest. So every little bit counts, of course. And even, honestly, just hitting the subscribe also really helps quite a bit. So feel free to contribute in any way that you would like to tomorrow, as it were. And that's what we have for Discovery 2.04.
And it's tomorrow STEAM.
It is.
I don't know if you guys caught that.
It is. Yeah, it's not just science. We're talking about science, technology, engineering, math, and sometimes arts. Yes. STEAM, because I can spell, is really what it comes down to. In any case, that's it for us today. Join us next time. We'll see you then.
Cool.
Bye.